for Innovation in Shelter, which is one of the members of the Way Forward Coalition. And we have the topic today on affordable housing and measuring affordability is really important because it impacts many of the policies that governments make and many of the decisions that impact investors make when they decide to engage in affordable housing. How do they measure affordability? Who gets included in the affordable category are some of the issues that we often speak about, but don't necessarily think too deeply about in terms of how we're measuring that affordability. And we have two speakers today who have done a lot of work and thinking around this. The first speaker that we're going to hear from is Alison Tshangana, and she is the head of research and market intelligence at the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa. She has long experience working in the public sector and the NGO sector, and CAHF has developed a housing affordability calculator, and so she's had to think really seriously about how you measure affordability. The next speaker we'll hear from is Sandeep Singh, who's an economist with the Development Impact Department of IFC, and he both leads the work around impact assessment for housing finance at IFC, and I'm going to read this, sorry. And he covers the design and implementation of IFC's Anticipated Impact Measurement and Monitoring, or AIM, framework for the financial sector. So both of these speakers are seriously steeped in how to measure affordability, and we're really thrilled and lucky to have them here with us. A couple of sort of housekeeping notes. My colleague, Monica Rashkin, is behind the scenes. She'll be monitoring the chat, and please do use the chat to both pop your names in and introduce yourselves, because we don't have time to go around and have everybody introduce themselves. Also, because this is the first of our series, we're interested if you have other topics that you'd like to see us cover, because this is a members-only a series and you're all members. We're happy to take any suggestions you might have for additional topics to cover in the future. And finally, if you have any questions for the speakers, please pop them into the chat as well, and we'll try to get to those during the Q&A, which brings me to my last point. The way that we're running this session is Alison and Sandeep are going to do their presentations back to back, and then we will have about, I think we'll have about 25 minutes for a conversation. And I'm really looking forward to that piece of it. But without further ado, let's get into the first presentation, and I'll hand it over to Alison.
There we go. Are you seeing the screen slides? Okay, super. Thank you. Yes, welcome. My name is Alison Tshangana. I'm with CAHF.
Alison is not in presentation mode, if you wanted that.
Okay, let's sort that out. And now, yes. Okay.
Yeah, much better. Thanks.
Okay, my name is Alison Tshangana. As Patrick said, I'm with CAHF, and greetings from good afternoon from Joburg and good morning. I'm going to just quickly share with you our experience at CAHF of developing a rough calculator for housing affordability. This project was done in cooperation with Shelter Afrique, who supported us, and the tool that I'm going to show you is available online on our CAHF website, as well as on Shelter Afrique's website. Just before to start off, just to contextualize, at CAHF, through our annual yearbook, we collect data from every African country around the price of the cheapest newly built house by a formal developer. And you can see here the range in terms of the costs to purchase that small but adequate house, ranging from the high costs in Seychelles and all the way down to Nigeria. We then do a calculation and ask ourselves, based on the incomes of people in different African countries, how many of those people and households can afford that cheapest newly built house if it was available in their country, and they had access to finance. And you can see by the spread of red across Africa that this question of housing affordability is absolutely critical. So what we've tried to do in our project was that we took this 30% notion that is still floating around and being used, and tried to figure out something that was slightly more nuanced, but yet still practical. So the 30% approach of telling oneself that a household spends 30% of their income or expenditure on housing costs is a very rough tool. So what we wanted to do was to, using the data that's available, to try to figure out if there's a more nuanced and more specific way that we can make that calculation, given the information that is available. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but there was a World Bank paper that was done by Matt Non. And two of the key findings that we took to heart when we developed this calculator was the realization that a progressive scale of income is much better to think about this. So if you look across countries, really the lower the income, the lower the share spent on housing. So 30% as a cookie cutter application across all income segments will not capture the diversity, particularly in developing countries. The other key point that's in the literature is that there's a linkage, of course, between housing and land and transportation. And there's trade-offs between those. So the closer one is located to economic opportunities, the less you have to spend on transport, and vice versa. So actually, it makes sense to consider housing and transport costs together. So what we've done is we've developed a project level calculator, and I'll walk you through how we did it. But I think the main point I want to stress is that we tried very hard to balance simplicity with accuracy. So the purpose was to get something that's better than the 30% rule, but also to recognize that all sorts of data that would ideally be available is not available in most contexts. So the framework that we used recognizes that housing affordability really is the relationship between what a household can pay and what the costs are for the developer or the supplier to meet those needs by building a unit. And then the mediating factor between those is housing finance. And that, of course, is impacted by households' access to that finance and the terms of the finance as well. I think one of the key points is that on the demand side, which is what I'll look at today and what the calculator focuses on, is that it's also important to think not just about the quantum of the income, how much is being received, but the type of income. So is it intermittent? Is it formal? Is it informal? How predictable is that income? And then also, as I alluded to earlier, we want to think about competing expenditure priorities, ideally. So recognizing that there's also demands to spend on education, on food, on other priorities, and that will impact on the amount spent on housing. What we're looking at in the calculator is the capacity to pay for housing by a household. We're not looking at effective demand, which takes into account a household's willingness to purchase that unit based on their own circumstances. So household size, or phase in their life, or location. So we're not considering effective demand so much as just the capacity to pay. So just quickly, this is some of the information that we gleaned from the literature review. And this specifically is from a paper from, again, the World Bank by Young and Lozano Gracia. But you can see that there's been some of the work to unpack the nuance below the 30%. So on the top, housing is in the red, and transportation is in the purple, and housing utilities is in the lighter color, the lighter pink. And you can see that according to the decile of income, the amount spent, the percentage spent on those priorities varies, but essentially ranges between about 12% and 12.6% and 11.7%. That was the finding from that paper. Also, there is some work that was done on housing and transportation in large cities in sub-Saharan Africa. And those are the two spider graphs at the bottom. And that tells us that for the largest city in all countries, the expenditure for housing was 20% or less. So the 30% already not being applicable or accurate. Transport expenditure, they found in these major cities, was between 2 and 10%. So these were some of the guidelines and the findings that we kept in mind as we created the calculator. So our calculator starts with, this is the steps of the formula that's underneath the process. We start with the monthly household income, which is inputted by the user. We had lots of difficulties working on getting data for income segments in various countries. But what we tried to do, since decile and quintile data was not available in most cases, we tried to determine 5 income segments using the median or average household income in the country, which may be more readily available. So we used that as the peg and then created income segments above and below it. Again, it's a rough tool, but I think the most critical gap in information actually is the income data. So based on the monthly household income, we then said, okay, based on the assumptions coming out of the literature review, we know that according to your monthly household income, you will spend more or less on housing and transport. So we used a progressive scale and said, the lower your income, the lower the percent spent on housing and transport. And those assumptions ranged from 18 to 30%. That's for housing and transport together. We then adjust for the transport cost. So we also ask the user to input the distance of the unit from the CBD. Now, again, this is a rough indicator because we're making an assumption that the household is employed in the CBD and they may be employed in a satellite community. So it's a rough indicator, but essentially it's trying to take into account the fact that the closer you are to the CBD, the less you will be spending on transport of household income. So we've made assumptions based from 3% to 10%. Depending on the distance from the CBD. After that, we're then going to apply the mortgage terms that are prevailing in the country. And this data is collected through our CAHF yearbook. So we take from the CAHF yearbook the interest rate, the tenure of the loan, as well as the down payment amount. And from that, we can then figure out the house price that is affordable to the households that are in that monthly household income segment. That have a monthly household income of the amount that the user inputted at the beginning of the process. So this shows a little bit of what the calculator looks like on the right-hand side that you can see. So essentially, we wanted the minimum data that you need to use the calculator to be very small, so that it was usable if you knew very little about the housing project and very little data was available. So at a minimum, you can use the calculator for any country in Africa. And all you need to know is the monthly income, either in dollars or in local currency, and the distance from the city center of the project, which of course can be found on Google Maps. Now, the monthly household income is the target that the developer, it's the target segment of the market that the developer is aiming for. Now, we also wanted to make the calculator more sophisticated if you had additional information available. So in the context where there is better income data, where you realize that the distance from the CBD is not actually the appropriate distance to be looking at, or if perhaps the mortgage interest rate has been negotiated between the developer and the nearby banks, or if the down payment rate is different. So you can change all of those assumptions as well in the calculator. So you can basically have the raw version, or you can also change the assumptions in order to see the impact of the change in different factors. So if we take an example from South Africa, at the top in step 1, we put in the monthly income, the distance from the CBD, I said 8,000 Rand a month, the distance from the CBD, 15 kilometers, and I put that in at the top. The calculator then uses the yearbook and the assumptions that I outlined to figure out that the applicable mortgage interest rate would be 9%, the bond term 30 years, the down payment 20%. And because I said 15 kilometers from the CBD, the calculator applies 6% as the amount that would be spent on transport by the household. And then because I said that the income was 8,000, it puts this household in the third from the top income bracket, which would mean that the amount spent on housing and transport is 27%. Okay. Those are the assumptions in the second step. So it will kick out answers for those. But say I also want to know, okay, well, if the household earns 8,000, it's going to have some degree of affordability. But what happens if we also wanted to target households that earn 15,000? How would it compare? So I can put that in the third step that allows me to put in different assumptions. And then it will kick out at the bottom a number of findings. So it will tell me that the loan amount that the household can afford, if they earn 8,000 Rand a month, that first column, is 208,000 Rand. Now, if the household earns 15,000 Rand, then the loan amount that they could afford would be 447, so a little less than R500,000. Okay. Now, if that's the loan amount, it then tells us the house price that they would be able to purchase, with the difference, of course, being the down payment. And then we've also, using the income data, done a calculation of the estimated number of urban households that could afford this house price in the country. So if I'm a developer in South Africa and I know that I'm targeting households in the income range of 8,000, and the property that I've bought, the land that I've bought, is 15 kilometers from the center of Joburg, I know that there are about 5.5 million people in South Africa who, if they could access the mortgage finance, would be able to hopefully purchase the home that I'm producing. And that's 48% of the general population. So that's the purpose that it's aimed. The calculator is really aimed for a developer thinking about how to target the units that they're building. So I think really the key point I want to make is around data. And the scarcity of data was the main issue that we encountered and the challenge in developing the calculator. Ideally, we'd be able to have quintile or decile data, income segments for each country. We could not find that. Ideally, you could have household survey data, which gives you a more accurate picture of how much people in that area spend on transport or on utilities. It would also be fantastic if we could have sub-national data around income. So even if it's data that says urban households earn this much versus rural, or households in this particular municipality. And then, of course, what we don't have is income information about the type of income, so formal versus informal. As I mentioned earlier, we're not taking into account the life circumstances, so the willingness of the household to pay that amount. So I think all that having been said, as I said, what the calculator does is it's an improvement on the 30% rule of thumb, we hope. And it also provides the flexibility that if you have additional information, you can use it. But if you don't have it, you can also use it. Now, the downside of the calculator, and which areas that we could strengthen and are considering. The first one is that the calculator it's very crude in how it deals with the deposit requirement. So it doesn't have a means to take into account whether or not the household has a 10% deposit available. And that does throw off the findings in some way, because obviously the larger the down payment, the less the loan is that has to be taken out. The calculator also doesn't take into account the long-term costs of staying in the house. So over time, I need to spend money on electricity, and I need to spend money on all sorts of other priorities. It doesn't take that into account, maintenance, for instance. It also doesn't allow for changes in costs over time. So if my interest rate goes up, that's not reflected. It's assuming static mortgage terms across the time period. And then lastly, of course, the calculator works on mortgage as a housing finance instrument. And it doesn't in that way reach down really to lower income segments to whom a mortgage may not be available. And of course, in some African countries, the mortgage market is so thin that even in higher income segments, mortgages are not available as well. So as I said, it's a crude tool, but I think it is an improvement on a 30% rule, and it has a lot of space for improvement and for the input of more specific data that is relevant to a particular situation. Thanks, Patrick. I'll stop for now.
Thanks, Alison. That was great. And I'm sure that there are already lots of questions, and I'll just remind people that we're doing the presentations back to back. So please do use the chat to pop in any questions you might have now. And then we'll open up the discussion after we hear from Sandeep. So Sandeep, over to you.
Hey, thank you, Patrick, for the invitation to speak here. I hope you can hear me well. So what I'm going to talk about today is insights from on this issue of measuring affordability from some research we've been doing with a bunch of colleagues. Many are in this meeting. What we're doing at IFC. And the affordability we're trying to focus on is very much on emerging markets and developing economies. And it's good to be also following Alison and CAHF, because symbolically a lot of really good research they have done on this topic was a springboard for what we sort of started to think about. So I'll start the presentation by talking about something we did about a year ago, which sort of brought a lot of the predicaments in a sense about measuring affordability. So about a year ago now, we introduced this concept called the Adequate Housing Index. This is a published paper. All this data is available, where the idea was to try to measure the adequacy of housing in emerging economies and developing economies from the ground up, from the household level up. So drawing on the latest household and expenditure surveys, assess whether at the household level, the house is adequate along various dimensions, and then sort of aggregate up to see, okay, what's going on at the city level, what's going on at the country level, and do this in a very systematic manner across countries. So the 7 dimensions we looked at, from the household surveys to sort of as an assessment of the adequacy of the housing, was over here. I won't go into details a lot here. This is published paper, but I want to sort of move to the second part a little bit quickly. Yeah. So we sort of look at these 7 dimensions, see if the household is adequate along these dimensions, and then sort of aggregate up at the household level, aggregate further up at the country level to produce what we call the Adequate Housing Index, a snapshot of what housing adequacy along these dimensions looks at the country level. And the neat thing from our perspective of doing all this work, and it was a lot of work because we had to harmonize all of these indicators across all the countries we covered, and we covered about 65 emerging economies. So it was quite a lot of work looking at all the surveys there, the latest surveys, and harmonizing these variables across all of them. But in the end, we had an Adequate Housing Index. And the good thing was that because we were building this from the ground, from the household level data, we can aggregate this as we like. So look at adequacy of those that are formally employed versus informally employed in a country. Those that have a certain occupation, let's say work in the agricultural sector versus not. So we could disaggregate in any way the household survey allows. I'll just show you like a quick snapshot of what we found. This is just at the country level, what the adequacy looks like. So it's sort of a quick snapshot based on household level data of what things look like across countries. But I'll refer you to the paper to look at. There were some more interesting things when we sort of look at within countries. So one of the measures we sort of put together was a Gini on the adequacy, right? So look at the inequality of housing adequacy within a country across the income segments, and we sort of constructed a Gini coefficient out of that, and it sort of got us interesting results. But what I want to now focus on, and I'm sure you noticed this, is why is affordability not one of the criteria there? And that's a very good question to ask, because we did sort of envision this being there in the beginning. And we did have these household expenditure and income surveys. And we thought we would sort of try to introduce some concept of affordability. But the problem we faced is that even though the overall income expenditure data was good, in fact, the World Bank uses these surveys to do their poverty estimates and so on, what we didn't have was a breakdown of what was housing related, or as Alison presented, transportation related. So what is this household spending on housing versus other things? That disaggregation was really hard to do on a consistent basis across these surveys. So a few surveys were really good quality, you could do this, but by and large, this was really hard to do from the household surveys. So the way we sort of set up our next line of inquiry on this was to bifurcate this issue. No, so the adequate housing index gives us an estimation of what is the need. What is the problem statement in a sense. And then we sort of said, okay, now let's look at affordability from a slightly different perspective, since this did not allow us to go into that. And that's where I'm going to sort of focus on the rest of the presentation. So one way we wanted to sort of measure affordability was at an aggregate level. And of course, one very popular popular measure used in developed economies mostly is the median household price divided by the median household income. No? So what's the relationship between the typical house versus the typical income? And this is a very cited, for example, in the US, this comes out very regularly. The key point here is that you need data. You need data on house prices. You need data on household income. So, but that was conceptually one way we wanted to look at affordability and in EMDES. And the second way, which is more for us was more interesting, was to look at a segmentation based on affordability. So what can we consider an affordable segment in emerging economies? So we wanted to, one, look at what income segment can afford the median house available in the formal market. So this is slightly different way of looking at the issue that we sort of looked at in one, because now we are matching an income with a house, right? And as Alison presented in a lot of detail, there's a lot of nuance in how you do that, and you have to bring in not just income and house price, but you have to bring in housing finance conditions. So there's a lot more data that's needed, and you also need data not just on one point, the median income, but you need a whole distribution of income for a country here. And the second data point we wanted to look at was, what is the income segment that can afford a basic 50 square meter apartment? We call this like the basic house price, because of course the median house might be very different across countries. So you're sort of comparing different things here. So one way to look at this was to sort of set the house at a certain level, and then look at how that is affordable across. No, but you can see that to do this, like conceptually, yes, seems like it sort of looks like a way to sort of understand affordability. But the main issue is, of course, data and measuring this, and that's where we're going to go next. So there's basically three buckets of things that we need here. One, we need income data, right? So on this one, we were fairly comfortable that all the work we had done on the household surveys, we had gathered a lot of income data, and that to us was okay. So that part we have covered. Then the second was on housing finance conditions. So this one also, it's sort of the work has already been done. CAHF has done work in Africa. Hofinet has tried to do this. So this is there. This data is out there. It's just a matter of collecting this data. So we were not too bothered by this requirement about collecting, data on tenors, on interest rates, and so forth. And at IFC, we also have a base of clients that we can rely on to gather this data. But the third part, which was house prices, what do median house prices look like? What does a basic 50 square meter apartment cost in certain countries? That was the hardest part. That is where there's absolutely no data. No, and rather than, I think, how Alison was presenting it, in that at a project level, you enter the price of the house. we wanted to look at it at more at a country level, understand the conditions that prevail right now in certain markets. So this is the house prices where we needed to do a lot of thinking on how do we get this. This data is not there. How do we generate this data? And this is where we sort of tried this big data approach. No, so yes, from the official sources, from public sources, we don't have this data. Let's try a technique that's been used a bit in some markets, more developed markets, and then try to see if that is a feasible way to sort of get house prices. So the idea here is we go to the largest real estate website where private property is listed, and we scrape data about the price, about other property attributes, and we sort of get a comprehensive data of what it looks like in a certain country. No, so this was very much like a sort of relying on not from expertise from a developer to tell us like, oh, what's the price in these markets, but rather to sort of scrape a lot of data and try to understand this. So to date, in 60 economies, we have sort of scraped 4 to 5 million unique data points and tens of millions of like overall data points, no, from the markets we are trying to study. So a lot of data now to analyze. And as a start, we wanted to generate, again, going back to the affordability concept we laid earlier, we want to generate 2 data points. One is just understand the median house price from this data, understanding that this data is going to be more on the formal market, right? So, and that is like, maybe we can get into that discussion a little bit, but there's pros and cons of this approach, and what we get is sort of the median house price from the formal market, what formal developers are doing. And then we used some techniques in machine learning, mainly random forest models, to try to now estimate what a basic 50 square meter apartment off city center costs in these markets. So this was more of a model approach to try to understand typically this basic house price, what would it cost here? And the key difference here is we were not trying to estimate the cheapest price, but rather a typical price for a 50 square meter basic house. So these sort of 2 data points is what would feed into the, the segmentation I was talking about earlier. Just to check on time, I'll try to go a little quicker. So just to sort of visualize some data points, for example, I've put together just 3 countries, Costa Rica, South Africa, Pakistan, and you see sort of we collected data on house, we collected data on apartments, and you see some scatter plots, or rather some histograms for what the data looks like. And also I sort of presented a scatter plot for if you sort of put together the price and the square meter, there's some interesting things that come out. Again, if we go into the details, we'll get bogged down. But of course, this is only 2 dimensions, the price and the square meter. We were collecting a lot of other attributes, such as bedrooms, bathrooms, location, and so on and so forth.
Sorry, Sandeep, I know you're trying to rush through that, but can you go back and can I just ask you to just maybe help us understand like the difference between South Africa and either Costa Rica or Pakistan? Those both look fairly similar, but South Africa looks really different.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question, Patrick. Thank you. What we see, so the reds over here are the apartments and the blues are houses. So one, we see in South Africa a clear bifurcation in that the cheaper houses are all smaller houses, or rather smaller houses are all apartments, are smaller, and the houses are bigger. Whereas we don't see that in the 2 markets, especially in Costa Rica, where it sort of is very mixed. Although you see some of that pattern, it's a lot mixed. Also, what you see from this data, one way to sort of look at this data would be that in Pakistan and Costa Rica, the size is very correlated with the price. No, so there is a strong link, and that's like one of the main predictors. In fact, right, you can draw a sort of a really good best fit out of this. So the other factors like location in particular is not it is probably driving some of that variation we see, but it's not really the main thing that is coming out. Whereas in South Africa, it's very interesting that relationship of size and price really doesn't exist. It's really a flat line, which tells us that other indicators, in particular the location, are what are driving. So you could have like a 200 square meter apartment, and they can be from like a very cheap one to a very expensive one, depending on the location. So size is not really the best indicator of price. And this is where our machine learning, the random forest model, comes in handy, because if we had tried to do a more of a parametric, econometric view of this, sort of doing OLS regressions, we would not have predicted the prices so well. Whereas a machine learning and sort of a decision tree based approach does exactly this. So it will not rely on the size as much in South Africa, but will rely on other attributes. I hope that's clear, Patrick.
Okay, thanks.
And of course, we're doing this for 60 economies. So there's a lot of data and a lot of thinking, and we're spending sleepless nights sort of analyzing this data. And we are about to actually come out with the paper, the technical paper, on this exact. So we just finished the peer reviews, and we are about to come out. So something that we can hopefully share publicly in a little bit. So now let's come back to this measure. No, so median house price, median household income. So median household income we have from our surveys, household surveys, median house price, all this scraping that we did. It gave us a lot of data, but it definitely gave us this data point. So I'll sort of present for now just some regional averages, no, just to not get bogged down into each country. So this is what it looks like across regions. So in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, this is really high at 26. So the relationship between a median house price and a median household income, it's 26 times. And just for context, in developed economies, once this starts to get above 2 or 3, it's considered, oh my God, the affordability is not there. These regions, what is going on in this region, and so on. So those are the benchmarks that have been set in developed economies, and we are blowing past this. Of course, the big caveat here is that this is formal markets, right? So median house price by formal developers. So that's a big caveat, and we have to sort of understand what exactly we're measuring. And even in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of variation. For example, South Africa, I think, is around 6 or 7 for the AHAM, but it's of course then much higher for other economies. But then the really interesting part is the second one, which I think for us was really important from a stakeholder, from a DFI perspective, to understand, okay, what segment should we be doing? What segment should we be focusing on in each country? That was like a fundamental thing we wanted to attack at IFC. So this is what it looks like. No, so if you look at the median house price in a lot of regions, it's sort of affordable to the very top of the market. You know, we knew this, but now there's a lot of data to get behind to sort of understand this. No, but even when you go to the basic house price, you go to a really basic 50 square meter apartment of city center that we saw the price we estimate, it's still really uncomfortably high. Who can really afford this? So it's sort of really speaking to formal markets really not working, and presentation of it in a very explicit way over here. No, so if we try, so from a stakeholder perspective, if we try to go to a sub-Saharan African country and insist on developing houses, insist on a developer developing houses that are targeting, let's say, of course, this is at the country level, we need to make these decisions, or even smaller, but going way down from where the market actually is, it might not be the most productive way to sort of direct our investments. So that is where we want to explore a lot more now that we have a foundation of the data. So with that, I'll stop my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandeep. Thanks. That's fascinating stuff, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions. But I'm going to use my position here of having the microphone to ask you to expand just a little bit on this issue of informality. It seems to me that the data that you are presenting shows that the formal markets that you're looking at really are not consequential for very low income people. Is that because there's so much informality in these markets that you're actually not picking up the true market that most people are operating in?
No, absolutely, Patrick. That's very true. So, and there are some estimates. Some estimates. Even the bank has done some estimates of what this informal market or informal self-build, incremental build. So we can sort of say it by very names, but not sort of a developer doing at scale a development. So that is like a big part of almost all economies that we looked at, no, and that is the part that we are mostly missing. In some countries, we did notice that those kinds of properties are also showing up, although the secondary market again is not that dynamic in a lot of economies. Those were showing up in some online marketplaces, but mostly it was the formal developers. So in that sense, the sort of even the measure of the affordability at an aggregate level is sort of missing what it looks like for a normal person, no? So for an average person who might sort of try to do this in the informal market, and that from the way we have looked at it, it's impossible. We can't really do it. So this was like a step to sort of try. So we want more formal markets. If that is where we think we can deliver scale, is by not trying to attacking on the informal side, but say that the formal market in all other markets is what delivers us the best outcomes. And the informality exists that because the formal markets are not working well. There's some market failure that's not allowing us to do that. And that's why these are propping up. So let's now try to understand, okay, what's going on in the formal market. So that's how we looked at it, as like a first step to shine the light on a part that should be working well, but is not. But of course, this does not speak to, I think, as you rightly pointed out, what affordability might look like a person who might rely on the informal market to deliver on the housing.
Yeah, so that's a huge challenge, and it's great to think about it in those terms and to have that kind of data that you've put together to really highlight that. I think we have a question now for Alison, and is it Robert Hornsby? I'm going to invite you to just ask your question to the group in person.
Well, thank you, thank you for that. We've been having a little bit of back and forth in the chat on this question, and I was in the middle of typing another question because there's a lot of expertise on this call, and I'm curious to learn as much as I can. The question I had asked originally was, as a builder, we struggle with this question of how long our buildings should be designed to last if we're designing and building for affordability. So we've built a business selling homes in the $70,000 to $90,000 range, mostly to diasporans. We are introducing homes in the $10,000 to $25,000 range to try to push more into the local market. Our methods are fairly sort of standard: reinforced concrete foundation, cement masonry walls, metal roofs. If you build that kind of home well, you can build a structure that will last for 50 to 100 years or more, right? It'll require some maintenance, but basically, if you get your concrete mix right, and you install your roofing properly, you've got a structure that will last for a very long time. And our struggle is, well, if we're trying to make something affordable for someone who's in the informal sector, earning local currency, for whom coming up with a down payment for a $10,000 home is even unrealistic, then would we have more impact building homes that are designed and built to last for 20 years instead of 50 to 100 years? And is that a direction that we should be pushing more into if what we really want is to address more of the local resident housing crisis?
And let me just ask, can you build that house for, say, half the price if it's lasting half as long?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great trade-off. And I think, Kesia, you had made the point in the chat also that there are environmental impacts if you're building houses for 20 years and not 100 years. So, Alison, do you want to respond?
I think it's such an interesting question. A number of thoughts come up. One could build the house for half as much, but in terms of what I'm just thinking that the land value won't change, right? So in terms of the asset value of the household that's purchased the unit and is sitting in it, they have the land regardless of the quality of the unit that's built on top of it. So that's important to remember. On the other hand, of course, if the house only has a 20-year lifespan, then their ability to realize the asset value through the resale market is reduced. And I think that's important to consider. I mean, the other option, of course, instead of changing the lifespan of the house, is to change the size and the typology. And from what we're learning, certainly in South Africa, I would suggest that making the house smaller, but making it possible for households to incrementally build upon that unit and expand it is actually a smarter way to go. And that makes a lot of sense because it synchronizes with how we know households build, and it also allows the quality at the outset. Thanks.
Great. Monica, are there other questions or people with hands up or anything, or should we move to the chat?
There was a question. Yeah, there was a question by Keisha. I can actually kick it over to you that you had for Sandeep. Want to come off mute?
Yeah, sure. Though Sandeep did answer it. I was just asking that median in unequal economies, median is a difficult number because there's not many people who live there. Not many people are in the middle, and people are on the edges. And so thinking about, I mean, South Africa is probably the most extreme example on this continent. And so thinking about that, how does that affect the analysis? Sandeep responded and said that one could extend the analysis. Sandeep?
And yeah, no, exactly, Casey. And also, I think the mean would have been much more problematic, right? Where it sort of is really skewed in highly unequal economies. It's a little bit skewed. Median is like half. It's sort of literally half are above it, half are below it. But you're exactly right that the half below it might sort of look again very different in how it sort of goes from really bottom and up. So that's why looking at the distribution is so important, and that's what looking at the household income allows us to do. And I didn't get into much detail, but this also, looking at the household income data, then throws a lot of issues about how it compares with other national data on income, no? And that was a big part of what we tried to suggest or come up with some solutions of that discrepancy there, because the per capita income suggested by household surveys looks very different than sort of from national statistics, and that's a problem that the bank group as a whole tackle or sort of tries to deal with in various ways. No, so that's a big part of what we tried to solve in some suggestions we had for that.
Alison, do you have a really quick comment to add to that? I do want to move us to one other topic. You're on mute there.
Yeah, sorry. I was really fascinated with the picture of the South African market and how it's so distinctly different than the other countries. And the way I interpret that is that there's much more affordability in the South African market because there's a whole lot more variation in terms of what kind of unit you can access at what price. And even if you want a large unit, you can get it cheaply. And even if you only want a very small unit, you can have a very expensive, well-built small unit, but there's that full range. And I'm just interested in, I'm trying to think, what is it about the South African market that created that picture as opposed to the other developing country housing market pictures?
Or is it the data source? Is it where the data is coming from? Is there, That's what I wonder too. But I do want to move us to the topic of rental, because I had a question about your model, Alison, and can that be used for rental as well as mortgage? And then, Maria, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, do you want to move to rental, or may I go back for a minute?
Oh, okay, please, yeah, go back. Go back.
So keep rental, you know, on the burner there. My question is on the IFC data. First of all, when we for Hofinet have to help the people that provide us the data with coming up with the median house price in sub-Saharan Africa. If I include the informal sector, which is of course the largest part of the housing market, I have a totally different price from the formal market, first of all. So what is included in that price, in that median house price, is critical, particularly for sub-Saharan Africa. And there is a lot of confusion about that figure. The other point I want to clarify here is in both the IFC data, but I know it's missing in the CAHF data, but in the IFC data, when you go to scraping, all right, do you include existing houses? The existing housing market is often a lot more affordable. So do you scrape prices of existing, informal, formal, all of them for sale? Or are you scraping only new construction? That is an important question because it influences the price level very dramatically, actually.
So Sandeep, maybe you can
I do that separately. Yeah.
Sandeep, maybe you can answer that in 1 minute. We're coming to the end of our time here.
Sure, Maria, and thank you for both the questions. On the second one, quickly, no, that's exactly right. And the answer is it sort of depends on the market. I think in for example, sub-Saharan Africa, the existing houses coming on sale in an online marketplace is almost non-existent, except maybe a few economies. So this is all about new construction. That was not a condition we set. So in a lot of, for example, ECA-LAC markets, we do see like a more full range of things. And that's where the scraping really works well, in that it's sort of getting a median house price that's closer to, I think, how you would sort of, we're looking at in sort of a Hofinet, about existing prices of in the secondary market, and that sort of reflecting of market or of housing that's sort of across the spectrum. But in many markets, and maybe not South Africa, that was an exception, but in a lot of the 60 countries we were trying to cover was where there's really no data. So this notion about median house price there being a comparable number to what we have was not there, and of course we will chat with you, Maria, more. But you can, that's not an estimate that exists. So let's at least do some estimate on what the new construction looks like, to see what formal developers are, and as a way of not comparing it with, I think, the other things, but saying that, okay, if you just look at what's coming, it should be representative of the entire spectrum, but it's not. It's really skewed to the very, very top, and that's what the data is showing.
Casey just put a really interesting and very true comment in there. You know, the lenders don't look at the actual price that people are willing to pay or able to pay. They're looking at what's available in the market. Can we please just for 2 minutes talk about rental? Because I think we realize that a lot of people, for them, affordability means the affordability of what they're able to rent, not what they're able to buy. And I wondered, Alison, as you were talking, if the calculator can handle a rental, it seems like that might be useful.
Thanks. We haven't considered rental, and I would have to think through whether the calculator would need adaptation in order to apply to rental. The one thought I have is that I wouldn't know how to take into account the willingness to, how the willingness to spend changes, whether you're contributing to your ownership or whether you're renting. And I would think it would change, that a household may be more or less willing to spend on rental or more or less willing to spend on ownership if they know that they're going to obviously have the title deed. So I wouldn't know how to take that into account. That would be the main consideration, I think.
Sandeep, can I ask you the same question? If IFC is looking at rent, I know that you had some rental data in your model.
Yeah, no. So in fact, in the model itself, there were places where we could scrape rental data, and it would be sort of a different analysis. For this first time, no, if there's too many issues, we would get lost. No, so let's take it in bite chunks. So we focused on the ownership, and that's how it was set up. But the same framework that we have applied on sort of looking at affordability in the segmentation versus nationally, scraping data from rental websites and then bringing it all together through some improved sort of matching that maybe can take account preferences and so on, we can do and get some data. I think the scraping part is sort of, to us, we are really excited about that, because that now allows us to sort of do this at a more higher frequency. If anything, we know the data quality will only improve as more of these move to the online transactions. No, so it'll sort of only improve, and we can sort of get a sort of a time series if we are committed to sort of keep scraping data. And with scraping, once you set up the program to sort of know what you need to grab, and it's sort of very simple. Then you just run with it. No, so there's very little sort of variable cost once you set it up in the beginning.
Great. Well,
so
thanks. That's all the time
later.
we have. We're going to have to leave it there. I'm sure that there's plenty of questions that are left unanswered, but we're all part of the same coalition, so we can all continue this conversation. Thank you, Sandeep. Thank you, Alison, for your presentations and your responses to the questions. And thanks for everybody who joined today. And we'll look forward to doing this again. And let us know if you have any